Welcome to New Realities. My name is Alan Steinfeld, and this program is an exploration of an emerging spiritual culture that's happening in this country and around the world. And each week I interview guests who are part of a new paradigm, a new worldview, a different perspective on who we are as conscious, evolving beings. Tonight's show will investigate the roots of where this all came from. I'm really excited about that. I'll be interviewing Mitch Horowitz about this book, Occult America. Joining me tonight is Patricia Taylor as my co-host, the lovely Patricia Taylor.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah,
it's a pleasure.
My West Coast correspondent, you know, and we're doing a bunch of things together just to see how that goes. So tonight, I'll be talking to Mitch Horowitz. This book is so valuable for me in understanding why I'm doing what I'm doing, you know, for the last 15 years, and where this all came from. Mitch writes how the roots of the spiritual movement is such a foundational energy in America.
Yes.
Yes.
You know, what we call alternative spirituality has been part of America going back to the colonial days. From very, very early in the nation's existence, America became known as a safe harbor for people with supernatural or alternative religious beliefs. It's quite remarkable, even going back to the 1600s, in Europe, particularly in Central Europe, there was a backlash against some of the occult spirituality and the spiritual liberalism that flowered up during the Renaissance. People started moving to the American colonies, a trickle of people with mystical beliefs who engaged in things that we today would call channeling or divination or numerology, or who are interested in prophetic traditions. They trickled to America, and many of them actually settled in the area of upstate New York, Philadelphia, other parts of the colonies. So in a sense, what happens here on this show really stands on the shoulders of America's earliest foundations.
It really does. It's so exciting.
Yeah, isn't it?
What was that question that you asked about being surprised?
No, I was asking when you had a structure for the book, like, were there many surprises coming up?
There really were surprises, and where I wound up was quite different from what I expected. For example, I expected the state of California to play a great role in the book, and it does. I mean, California has been the engine for New Age spirituality throughout the 20th century. But I was really astonished to find that I suppose what you could call the California of the 19th century was in upstate New York. There was a section of central New York State that was called the Burned Over District between Albany and Buffalo, that in the early decades of the 1800s produced just every spiritual and social innovation you could imagine in this country, from spiritualism to new religions like
Mormonism, to John Smith.
Right
I mean, that part of New York State is such a mecca. You could really call it a mecca.
You could call it a mecca. It's the Mount Sinai of American mysticism.
Why'd they call it the Burned Over District?
Well, it was considered burned over by the fires of religious passion. And the term used to get used by these itinerant ministers who crisscrossed throughout the region in the early decades of the 19th century. And the story goes that one minister said to another, "Don't bother going there, that place is burned over. Everybody belongs to something up there. Every soul up there has a commitment." Joseph Smith's family, the Mormon prophet, he grew up in central New York State, and he and his family in the early decades of the 1800s were involved in a very wide variety of occult and mystical spiritual practices. It informed his worldview. That place, central New York State, it was a great psychic highway for all these new ideas.
Well, it still is. Lilydale's still there.
That's right.
So that was a foundation for American spirituality. But the big question, and I'm into this stuff. And, is it the land that's there?
That's a wonderful question.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful question. And this goes back to Joseph Smith. There was always a folklore in the area that region of central New York had been home to some sort of a ancient tribe or ancient group of people that, according to the folklore, was older than the oldest Indian tribes and eventually was wiped out in a war or confrontation with the Indian tribes. You find a thread of that narrative in the Book of Mormon, and that folklore ran very deep in central New York State. So there was always a kind of, I don't know, I guess a mystical presumption that there was something more than what was seen by the eyes going on in central New York.
Yeah, it's very strange.
You know, and this is something your listeners will enjoy. The very term Law of attraction was born in the Hudson River Valley. There was a medium or a channeler named Andrew Jackson Davis who lived in the town of Poughkeepsie in the mid-19th century. He was known as the Poughkeepsie Seer. People were making fun of him a little bit when they called him that, but he had a sense of humor about himself, and he embraced that title. And Davis, in one of his books in 1855, actually coined the term law of attraction, which he didn't mean as a law of mental cause and effect, but he was using it as to explain a cosmic law, as he saw it, that dictated what kinds of spirits would be attracted during seances based on the character of the people sitting in the seance circle. So much of what we take for granted, so much of what seems to have been with us forever, like law of attraction, came out of places like the Hudson Valley, upstate New York. It was a spiritual hotbed.
Is that where they pulled some of the concepts of the secret?
Absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely. You know, the antecedents for many, many things that you find in The Secret and other expressions of the mind power philosophy, you find in early American mysticism, particularly the mental healing movement, for example, which grew out of New England, roughly starting in the 1830s, 1840s. Mental healing, the law of attraction, the idea of channeling, spiritualism, seances, all of this was homegrown in the New York and New England area.
One question, though, is like you call it occult America, but it's more spiritual than for me. I mean, for me, occult is sort of dark. If you go into an occult bookstore as opposed to a New Age bookstore, it's dark as opposed to and you actually highlight a lot of the spiritual principles and not so much of this dark, secret, magical occult stuff.
Well, you know, for me, the term occult has a certain romance to it, and it also has real historical integrity because the people who were engaged in a kind of boundaryless, churchless spirituality during the Renaissance, they used the term occult. And eventually that spiritual, which really it comes from Latin meaning secret or hidden, they were referring to the religious philosophies of ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, ancient Greece. Spirituality which was being reborn during the Renaissance, but which no longer had any church or priesthood or dogma behind it. So people with occult interest during the Renaissance began to trickle to America, and that formed the foundation for our alternative spirituality and what we today call the New Age. So I have a certain attachment to the term, and I like its roots.
It's a powerful title, and I was surprised to not see any of the darkness, you know, in it.
Well, you know, for me, the light so greatly outshone the darkness. You know, with people like Andrew Jackson Davis or the spiritualist movement, movements around mental healing, prophecy, divination, number symbolism. So many of the people involved in these things from very early on in America, many of them, they saw themselves as Christians. They felt they were walking in the footsteps of the Gospels. They were living in light of the ethics of the Gospels, but they also believed in a spirituality that went beyond church walls. So the light that I found was just so overwhelming. You know, people were looking for meaningful ways to live.
Reading the book, I couldn't really tell what your position was. It's sort of like a little arm's length. Does this guy believe all this stuff? Because you also expose a lot of the hoaxes and a lot of the weird stuff. So what's the personal angle? And it
it's a very fair question.
I mean,
when I'm a critic, I'm a sympathetic critic. When I'm a believer, I'm a critical believer. But I really do believe that the occult spiritual search as it's played out in this country and New Age spirituality is a tremendous vessel for meaning. It has been in my life personally.
Thank you.
It's been in the life of people I know. So I think this is a very deeply legitimate and fundamental part of spirituality in America.
And I think that's why I do this program. As a forum for people to explore this deep part of themselves. What was your spiritual beginnings, awakenings? Where did you?
Well, I was about 13, around my early teens, and I had an out-of-body experience. Quite a few of them actually, and I was so scared of them. I just sometimes lie in bed and I'd be like, please don't take me. I'd be frightened to go to sleep, and then I'd see myself just going, just traveling.
Well, I think that's a really important comment because people have had experiences, and there's no place in religion for answers like this.
And again, you know, I come back to this again and again in the book, the kind of experience that Patricia just described. That kind of spirituality, that deeply personal spirituality that involves no intermediary, it's been a fundamental part of our religious development as a nation here, going way back to the beginning. For instance, in 1776, there was a young woman living in Cumberland, Rhode Island, named Jemima Wilkinson. She was struck with typhus fever. She fell into a coma. Her Quaker parents thought for sure she was a goner. And one day in the fall of 1776, she springs up from her bed, announces to her shocked family that the girl they knew as Jemima has died, and the being standing before them shall be known as the public universal friend.
She had like a walk-in.
Yes, she was the first walk-in.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And she called herself. She was a supernatural medium, a trance channeler, and she started to travel around New England, New York, the Philadelphia area, proclaiming herself an avatar to the divine. This is what we today might call channeling, and it was going on in this country. In effect, she was the first American-born female religious leader.
Wow, I wish I was doing my show then. I would have interviewed all those people.
No, it's so great that she was able to embrace it and like go with it. You know, for me, I found I didn't want to be a freak, so I didn't tell anyone for the longest time. And I think there's a lot of people out there that have these experiences that are either ashamed of them, confused by them, and they don't talk about them.
Absolutely.
Not me. That's why I do this show, so people can come out and share. It's so important that we start to make this more mainstream.
That's right. That's right. And I find there's a whole revolution going on today in channeling. I mean, this has obviously been with us for a long time, but there are so many people interested in channeled spirituality, and it's so valuable for them to even have a vocabulary to describe their experience.
I think more and more we can see ourselves as vehicles of divine emanation.
Yes, and the manner in which the individual is seen to serve as a kind of vessel for a divine influence, you find that religious outlook in some of the surviving literature from the world of ancient Egypt. I mean, this was some of humankind's earliest religious expression. We call it new, but it goes back to the deepest roots.
This is, in a sense, who we really are. You know, we like that cliche now, we're not humans having a spiritual experience, we're spirits having a human experience, but if we knew more about, if we had a deeper acknowledgement of that, I think that could change the whole culture. So how can we use what you've researched, which is very well researched, to start to change a culture in that way?
I want people to feel at liberty to participate in a spirituality that is without intermediaries or boundaries or you know, the walls of any particular institution. I want them to feel validated in doing that by understanding that we've always been doing it. You know, we speak in terms of positive thinking, and some people see that as a New Age philosophy. The whole positive thinking idea animates some of our largest evangelical Christian media ministries today. The concept of the individual human as a vessel for divine energies, that idea is found at the center of Alcoholics Anonymous and the various 12-step and recovery movements today. This is our spirituality. You know, whatever we call ourselves, evangelicals or Jews or Hindus or whatever, this is our spirituality. So I want that in itself to serve as a kind of liberating influence for people. You're not breaking with something from your past.
But the big thing is that the media is controlled by pretty straight-laced-minded people.
But in private, I find so many of the producers and the personalities and the people engaged in mainstream media are very open to this material. You know, I mean, across a dinner table, I'm all but asked to give people palm readings, you know, and then on Monday morning, things get a little more straight-laced. And yet, within mainstream media has played a very important role in validating some of these experiences. For example, the newspaper editor Horace Greeley, who's one of the great names in the history of reformist journalism in America, in the mid-19th century, he traveled from New York City to upstate New York, outside of Rochester, where there were these two young girls in a cabin in the winter of 1848, claiming that they were hearing spirit raps throughout their house. He validated their experience. He said they're not frauds, they're not faking it, there's something of an authentic supernatural quality going on here, and Greeley helped instigate the movement that came to be known as spiritualism. So mainstream figures have played a role in validating
this. That movement was huge, and you talk about how it even went into the White House with Lincoln.
Yes, it did. Yes, it did.
But talk about how big you think that was in the mid-1800s.
It was truly vast, and the numbers are hard to come by, but I've gone through them as carefully as I can in the book, and I would say probably about, and we were a country of roughly 30 million people in the mid-19th century, about 10% of free adults were engaged in spiritualism in one degree or another, and by that I mean belonged to seance societies, belonged to spiritualist clubs, subscribed to spiritualist newspapers, belonged to some kind of a spiritualist church or congregation. The numbers were vast. And indeed, Mary Todd Lincoln, the First Lady to Abe Lincoln, she was a committed spiritualist. This was a serious commitment for her, and she brought mediums into the White House. By the 1870s, spiritualism in this country had gotten more flamboyant. Mediums were manifesting a lot more physical phenomena, and that's when some of the sort of phony baloney stuff started to creep in. Although I wouldn't necessarily say that dominated the movement. It was part of it. Lincoln permitted a reporter from the Boston Gazette to be present at one of his White House seances. And I go through this as carefully as I possibly can in the book.
Yeah, you do it very well.
Thank you. I'm sure there was one, maybe as many as 2 seances in the White House. A reporter was present for one, and Lincoln was joking around during the seance. But that, too, opens a helpful window on spiritualism, because for some people, like Mary Todd Lincoln, it was a deeply serious commitment. For others, like Abe Lincoln, it was more of a novelty. People took it with a pinch of salt. They were agnostic about it, but they were willing to give it a try.
The fact that there have been like these frauds,
yes,
you know, and it sort of tarnishes the whole movement.
Yes.
And there's still some today, people claiming to be channeling this or
absolutely.
that. And, you know, even though I'm so into this,
yeah,
it's like, even I'm like, is this true? Am I
right,
crazy?
Right.
And so this has been the history also.
Yes.
And
well, first of all, that's a very healthy place to come from, because the frauds have to be acknowledged. And my hat is off to the mainstream historians who for years and years and years have exposed these frauds, particularly as they related to spiritualism and such. At the same time, what many mainstream historians have failed to do is to understand that movements that come under the banner of occultism or mysticism or New Age, they are also communities of belief, and they deserve to be, they must be taken seriously in order for us to understand our own religious development as a nation. And I often say to people, every religion, every historical faith, at its starting point has some kind of supernatural basis. Whether it's Moses, you know, parting the Red Sea, or Christ rising from the grave, or, you know, Buddha gaining enlightenment under a Bodhi tree. You know, I think if you held any historic faith up to the mirror of absolute empirical truth or falsehood, none could pass. Judaism or Christianity could not pass at their inception. So, you know, at a certain point, these supernatural claims kind of pass into history, and we have to ask, what are the ethics? What's the philosophy? What's the fruit of the faith? And by that, you know, determine its posterity and its value.
But it's still, the exposing of those charlatans spills over and gets in the way of someone looking for those spiritual understanding.
Yes.
So maybe you can help me within my own sense of self. How do I, in a way, trust what I know to be true? Do you know? Do you know
No, I do. Yeah, I do.
You know, I think that when approaching a new religion or a figure or set of ideas that have some sort of supernatural claim around them, I think one has to start by asking, does this information, does this communication, whatever its source, square with a kind of universal ethics? For me, for example, Edgar Cayce, a great medical clairvoyant and channeler from the early 20th century, the theology, the ethics, the psychology that came through Cayce's channeled readings, it provided a great, great doorway to the perennial tradition, to the universal ethics that you find in Plato, that you find in the Gospels. A contemporary channeler, Paul Selig, who you've interviewed recently, Paul's work is the same way. It almost confirms, it gives one a fresh way of confirming the universal ethics that have traveled through all of our religious traditions. But it does so in a way that I suppose is more intimate, is more immediate. We need new doorways to the traditions.
And so this is so important because it gives us a foundation for our culture to start to pursue those levels of awakening. And now we're in this new time of higher ideals. I mean, if it was 10% with the spiritualists in the 1800s, now in the early 21st century, how many people would you say are open to, what percentage of the population?
My gosh, it's vast. I mean, if you were to tally up the percentage of people who in one form or another participate in positive thinking teachings, whether on the New Age or whether in evangelical churches, the percentage of people who have been part of recovery groups, 12-step groups,
yoga classes,
meditation, or
we were talking about this. Remember I was saying, like, even 15 years ago from when you first started to now, the big shift.
Yeah.
Everyone, I mean, now you have the 2012.
Right.
The
Yes.
movies coming out for that.
Right,
I mean,
Deepak
really
Chopra.
exciting.
Everybody knows Deepak Chopra.
Everybody knows Deepak.
In fact,
yeah.
he wrote something
Oh,
really
he
lovely.
did. He wrote
didn't he?
extraordinary
He's very
about this
generous.
book.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, is it 25% that would say, or is it 50%? Would you say?
I would honestly have to say that a majority of people in the country, one way or another, whatever they call themselves, whatever walk of life they're from, they have been touched by what we would call New Age spiritual teachings, whether it's through a recovery group, the positive thinking movement, natural health, meditation, yoga, or some of the things that are considered more avant-garde, like channeling. Anybody who's participating in workplace yoga, for example, is part of this movement. Anybody who's participating in mind-body stress reduction. Anybody who's, you know, a spouse or boyfriend or girlfriend is reading a book by Deepak Chopra and talking to them about
They're
it.
part of this.
They're part of it.
Yeah.
They're
And they
touched
should
by
be
it in
watching
some
this
way.
program
That's
and,
right.
and like reading this book as well.
Oh, thank you.
Did you feel you channeled some of this, a part of this?
I can't say that, but I can say that
Just
certainly certain channeled material, specifically the material that's come through Edgar Casey, has been a tremendous
Yeah.
inspiration to me. There were moments as I was working on this book where I had to ask myself some of the questions that you all have brought up. You know, how do you separate the fine from the coarse? How do you separate true gold from false gold? And for me, Casey, for example, was always a source of true gold. That reminded me that there was something there that really touched on what I felt to be some kind of ultimate truth.
Hopefully, there is something deeper in all of us that makes the spiritual search valid.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Yeah,
because
you know, one of the beliefs that really motivated the Renaissance mind, one of the great passions that motivated people who were interested in the spiritual opening that was flowering in the West during the Renaissance, was this notion, this idea that in our world there exists some ancient primeval spirituality, something older than everything else, and all of our modern religions grow out of it, like trees out of some great unseen underground river.
Yeah.
For Renaissance thinkers, that was the culture of ancient Egypt. They tended to associate ancient Egypt with this pristine, early, primeval philosophy, and some of them referred to that as an occult philosophy.
Right.
Now, Madame Blavatsky and the founders of the Theosophy movement in the 1870s, they too took up that search. They took up that search in the modern world. Madame Blavatsky and Colonel Henry Steele Olcott, both New Yorkers at one time in their lives, I'm happy to say, they took to heart the idea that the Renaissance religious thinkers were correct. They were right. There was some ancient occult spirituality that's been lost to us modern people today, and they set it as their mission to find that. So that search has echoed throughout the ages, and I think it found a tremendously hospitable home here in America, and it continues to. But I believe that at the heart of things, you know, those of us who participate in a kind of boundaryless spirituality, a very individually directed spirituality, in some ways historically are part of that search.
I think you're right, and you say, almost in a sense, it can almost only happen here in America because we're not tied to the traditions of the old world.
And there's less to undo. There's, you know, there's
Undo.
less guilt, there's less fear.
There's more freedom of thought here. Is it ever going to be the mainstream? Are we ever going to, is it ever going to overthrow religions? I mean, this is...
Well, you know, we human beings have a terrible habit of replacing, you know, what we overthrow with the very thing that was being replaced. So if it does, you know, it'll become calcified. But,
That's too bad.
But I do think that, I do sense, especially in private, when people are really willing to open up, there is a tremendous openness to people's spiritual yearnings and spiritual search in this country. I'm so surprised at the number of people who I meet who in public will say, look, I don't put up with any of this nonsense, but then in private, you know, they start telling me stories and experiences that they had that are, you know, vastly more occult in nature than anything I've experienced. So it is out there.
But why do we have to mask it behind religion? And I mean, it's so frustrating because there is a science to the incarnational experience. And I think people you mentioned in this book, Manly P. Hall, Edgar Casey, Madame Blavatsky, these are visionaries. They are the founders of this thought.
They're our forefounders, absolutely.
And I know you highlight some of these great people. I mean, who did you like, and who did you personally, like Edgar Cayce, you felt a connection to?
Tremendous connection to Edgar Cayce, a connection to Manly P. Hall.
Ah.
Although, you know, a sorrow at his career too, because Manly P. Hall, who was such a great philosopher of wisdom traditions from around the world, experienced, I think, a real decline in old age. Not a mental decline, but he was surrounded by some very destructive people, and I write about this in the book. And it seems at a moment when his health was suffering and he needed to summon up the guidance from these ethical and religious philosophies that he devoted his life to, that guidance was lost to him. So, but there's a great mystery there, you know, and we as seekers need to know that story and see that story as a kind of cautionary tale.
You're right, because you seem these people have this psychic power, but then they end up getting divorced and these lawsuits. It's like, why? How do you explain that?
That is one of the great mysteries of human nature, how these teachings fail to penetrate. You know, we spend our whole lives around these things, and yet at the moment where they're most needed, they can fail to penetrate. And I wouldn't seek to answer that. I would just ask that everybody kind of hold that as a question, because there's a perplexity in human nature that points to.
So you're saying the mind could just block it out, even if that's coming?
Yes, something
or
in
the
us
emotion
won't be penetrated by
Very
truth.
interesting.
And that's something that we need to look at.
Yes, yeah, I agree.
So, any final words, I mean, to the public? I totally recommend this book, Occult America, Mitch Horowitz. You know, you've collected so much information. I'm sure there's much more that you couldn't put in the book.
What's the new book? What's the name of the new book?
The new book is called The Secret History of Positive Thinking, and it's about the positive thinking movement from the mental healing movement in New England up through Norman Vincent Peale and The Secret and the mass ministries today that are based on positive thinking. It's going to be a panoramic history of that entire movement.
Wonderful.
And is there anything you could leave, like, so we touched upon it, and you've seen the patterns,
Yes.
you know? What would you say to people? And is there a big change that seems to be happening?
I would say yes to all that, and I would put it in these terms. The New Age is mainstream. New Age spirituality, therapeutic spirituality, all these things that have their roots in occult and mystical movements have become part of the groundwater of our religious culture in this country and throughout the West. It's not something to be afraid of. It's not something to be embarrassed by or to apologize for. It's the root work of our religious culture in this country. It is mainstream, and I think we should feel very free in embracing it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes,
Glad to be here.
really
Thank you so much.
Thank you for
Thank
being
you.
here.
Sure.
It
Thank
really
you.
gave me a sense that I'm not doing something in isolation.
You're not.
This is, I'm part of a history.
Yeah, that's it.
And that really feels good.
Yeah, there's very deep roots there.
It really does. Like, because I've studied these people. Madame Blavatsky is the godmother of everything that happened in the New Age.
She really is.
Channeling the divine feminine, Egypt. It's like she was a superstar.
She was.
I mean,
She was amazing.
actually like a spiritual genius in a sense.
Yeah, I feel that way very much.
Yeah. This is Alan Steinfeld for New Realities. I've been talking to Mitch Horowitz, Occult America, along with Patricia Taylor.
Thank you.
And if people want to get in touch with you, or the website for the book.
My website, they could just put my name into Google, Mitch Horowitz. My website is mitchhorowitz.com.
And if you want to reach me and Patricia, go to newrealities.com. Thanks for watching. See you next time.
Thank you.